December 16th, 1945, 4:17 a.m., the Ardennes Forest. The snow fell in whispers, each flake a small betrayal, covering the wire that Corporal John Reynolds had spent the last 72 hours stringing between the frost-blackened pines. His fingers, wrapped in strips of torn undershirt beneath regulation gloves, had lost most of their feeling around hour 50. Now they moved by memory alone, tying the 104th knot in a pattern his father had taught him in the copper mines of Butte, Montana. A pattern for supporting tunnel ceilings that might collapse. A pattern for staying alive. The wire sang as he pulled it taut. Behind him, someone laughed. "Still at it, Reynolds?" Sergeant Bob Kennedy's voice carried the particular edge of a man who'd stopped believing in anything 3 towns ago. "Building your little fairy castle?" John didn't turn. His hands continued their work, connecting the detonation wire from the 57th Mark II fragmentation grenade to the primary trunk line. 60 grenades total, 30 trigger wires, a redundancy that would have made his father nod with quiet approval before descending into the earth for another shift. "You hear me, Corporal?" Kennedy's boots crunched closer through the snow. "The Krauts come through here, they're going to waltz right past your stupid trap and shoot us while you're still trying to remember which string is which." The other men laughed. Not cruel laughter, exactly, just the laughter of soldiers who had stopped imagining tomorrow and needed to fill the space where hope used to live. Reynolds knew that laugh. Had heard it in the mine when someone suggested a new safety procedure. Heard it again when his father came home one evening and showed the family his schematic for a progressive support system that could prevent cave-ins. His mother had laughed too, gently, while stirring beans on the stove. "That's nice, honey," she'd said, not understanding that in 6 months, that system would save 12 men when the number 4 shaft collapsed. His father had died in the number 7 shaft anyway, but that was different. Some collapses you can prevent, others you can only witness. "Answer me when I'm talking to you. It'll work, Sergeant." John's voice was quiet, factual. He tied off the wire and moved to the next position. The mathematics are sound. Mathematics. Kennedy spat into the snow. "This isn't a classroom, college boy. I never went to college, Sergeant. Learned this in the mines. Load calculation, stress distribution, progressive failure analysis." He glanced back finally, his face gray beneath 3 days of stubble. "We're on the weak point of the line. Captain Morrison told me himself. If they probe our section, we fold. We don't have the men to hold this position conventionally. So your solution is to waste 60 grenades on some Rube Goldberg nightmare that probably won't even work?" Kennedy shook his head. "Those are defensive grenades, Reynolds, meant to be thrown, not strung up like Christmas decorations. They'll work." "How do you know?" "Because I've been wrong before." John Reynolds had arrived in Europe with the 101st Airborne Division on June 7, 1944. 1 day after the beaches. 1 day after the doors of history had opened and swallowed thousands of men whole. He came as a replacement, which meant he arrived with 2 things: a rifle he'd barely fired, and the knowledge that he was replacing someone who was already dead. The division was legendary even then. Screaming Eagles, men who jumped from airplanes in the dark and fought wherever they landed. John had never been on an airplane before his transport across the Atlantic, had never fired a weapon in anger, had never seen a dead man except his father, laid out in the front room of their company house, hands folded across his chest like he was just resting. "You'll be fine," the sergeant in England had told him during the brief training period. "Just do what you're told and keep your head down. These boys know what they're doing." But the boys who knew what they were doing were dying. By July, by August, by September, John watched them go, one after another, replaced by other boys who also didn't know what they were doing. He survived through a combination of luck, silence, and an instinct for terrain that he'd developed underground. In the mines, you learn to read spaces, to understand how force moved through rock, through timber, through empty air. You learned which walls could be trusted and which ones were waiting to come down. The European landscape spoke the same language. Hills that funneled movement, forests that channeled attack, villages that created fatal bottlenecks. John saw it all with a miner's eyes, understanding that war was just another form of excavation. You dug in, or you died. By December, he'd made corporal, not through heroism, but through the simple mathematics of survival. When you outlive enough men, they give you a rank. When you show you can read terrain and place men in positions where they might not die, they listen to your suggestions. Sometimes. The 101st Airborne had been sent to a small Belgian town to rest. Rest, in the parlance of military euphemism, meant occupying positions that were unlikely to see action. The Ardennes Forest in December 1944 was considered unlikely. The Germans were beaten, everyone said, falling back on all fronts. This was just mop-up duty. Guard the forest, stay warm if you could, and wait for the war to end. John had believed it for about 36 hours. Then he'd walked the line with his engineer's eye and felt the same sensation he'd felt in the number 7 shaft 2 hours before it collapsed. A kind of pressure in the air, a sense that the mathematics of the situation were wrong. Their section held the northeastern approach to the town, a weak position, too much frontage for their numbers, trees too thick for good fields of fire, natural avenues of approach that an attacking force could use to get close before being detected. In mining terms, it was a fault line, a place where pressure would concentrate and break. He'd tried to explain it to Captain Morrison. The captain had listened, which was more than most officers did, and then said, "We don't have the men to strengthen this position, Corporal. If the Germans come, and they won't, we'll just have to hold as best we can." "What if we reinforce the position mechanically, sir?" "What do you mean?" And John had explained about progressive reinforcement, about how in the mines, when you couldn't add more support beams, you created systems that multiplied force. Arranged explosives to bring down strategic ceiling sections that would block off dangerous areas. Used the rock itself as a weapon. "We could do the same here, sir, with grenades." Morrison had looked at him for a long moment, then shrugged. "You want to spend your time building some kind of trap? Go ahead. Can't hurt. Might even do some good if the impossible happens." The impossible happened 72 hours later. December 16th, 4 a.m. John Reynolds was finishing the last connection when the artillery started. Not close artillery, not the kind that kills you immediately. This was distant, rolling, persistent. The sound of preparation, of something vast being set in motion. He'd heard similar sounds in the mine when the deeper shafts were being blasted open. That percussion that traveled through earth and air and bone, telling you that the structure of the world was about to change. He finished the final connection and sat back in the snow, reviewing his work one last time. 60 Mark II fragmentation grenades, arranged in a honeycomb pattern across a front of approximately 200 meters. Each grenade connected to at least 2 trigger wires, most connected to 3 or 4. 30 primary trigger wires stretched across the most likely approaches, each one attached to multiple grenades. The system was designed with the same principle his father had used in the mines: redundancy and cascading failure. If one wire broke, others would still trigger. If one grenade failed, its neighbors would detonate anyway. The mathematics were elegant. An attacking force would have to avoid 30 near-invisible wires stretched at ankle height through snow and darkness. They would have to advance slowly, carefully, spreading out. And soldiers don't spread out when they're attacking. They bunch up, they follow leaders, they take the easiest path, which meant they would hit the wires. And when they hit the wires, the grenades would detonate. Not all at once, in sequence, each explosion triggering sympathetic detonations in the grenades nearby. A progressive failure that would turn the entire approach into a killing field for approximately 20 seconds. In theory, John had never tested the system. Testing would have required detonating grenades, which would have alerted the Germans and wasted munitions. So he'd done what engineers always do: checked his calculations multiple times, trusted the mathematics, and hoped. The artillery intensified, closer now. Kennedy came thrashing through the snow, his face ashen in the pre-dawn darkness. "Captain wants everyone in position. Now! The whole fucking German army is coming." The whole army? 3 armies, maybe 4. Radio says they hit all along the line, thousands of them. Tanks, infantry, everything. Kennedy grabs John's shoulder. "Your stupid trap better work, college boy, because we're about to die." John didn't answer. He was thinking about the number 7 shaft, about how his father had known, somehow, that the support system wouldn't hold. Had known and gone down anyway, because the alternative was abandoning 12 other miners who were already underground. Sometimes you do the work because it needs doing. Sometimes you check the mathematics and trust them because trust is all you have left. They came at 4:17 a.m. 25 men, German infantry, veterans of the Eastern Front probably, moving with the kind of confidence that comes from winning. They advanced in a loose wedge formation, weapons ready, each man covering his sector. Professional soldiers doing professional work. John watched them from his foxhole, his hands wrapped around his rifle, his mind counting distances. 200 meters. 175. 150. At 100 meters, they would hit the first wire. He'd positioned it across the most obvious approach, a slight depression in the forest floor that channeled movement like a river channel directing water. 125 meters. 100 meters. The lead German, an Obergefreiter judging by his insignia, stepped forward. His name was Hans Schmidt, though John wouldn't learn that until later, when he searched the bodies. Schmidt was 26 years old, had a wife in Munich, carried a photograph of his daughter in his breast pocket. In another world, he and John Reynolds might have shared a beer and complained about their respective fathers. Might have discovered they both knew how to tie a bowline knot, how to calculate load stress, how to survive underground. But this was not that world. Schmidt's boot caught the wire at 97 meters. What happened next took 19 seconds. The first grenade detonated at Schmidt's feet. The Mark II had a killing radius of about 5 meters, a casualty radius of 15. The initial blast took Schmidt and the 2 men flanking him, but the real devastation came from what the engineers call sympathetic detonation. The shock wave from the first explosion triggered 3 more grenades. Those triggered 5 more. Those triggered 7 more. The cascade ran through the forest like a fire through tinder. 57 of the 60 grenades detonated in a sequence that, years later, would be studied by military engineers trying to understand how an improvised system achieved such perfect timing. The explosions weren't simultaneous. That would have wasted force. They were progressive, each one catching survivors who were diving for cover from the previous one. In mining, they called it a progressive collapse. In war, it was just death. When the smoke cleared, John Reynolds was still in his foxhole, his ears ringing, his hands shaking. Beside him, Kennedy was staring at the forest with an expression of pure disbelief. "Jesus Christ," Kennedy whispered. "Jesus fucking Christ." 25 German soldiers had entered the forest. 25 German soldiers lay in it now, scattered across the 200 meters that John had wired. Some died instantly. Some died over the next few minutes, calling for medics who couldn't reach them to the smoke and fire and continuing detonations of ammunition. By dawn, all 25 were dead. John threw up in his foxhole. Then he reloaded his rifle and waited for the next attack. It never came. The German command, monitoring the attack through radio reports that stopped mid-transmission, drew a logical conclusion. The Americans had developed a new type of automated defensive weapon, some kind of advanced minefield or mechanized system that could detonate with devastating precision. To assault that position again would require specialized equipment, engineers, time. So they went elsewhere, probed other sections, found success in places where terrified boys with rifles tried to hold impossible positions. But not in John Reynolds' sector. His section held for 3 days as the Battle of the Bulge raged across Belgium and Luxembourg, as thousands died and entire units dissolved. The weak point in the American line remained intact, not because of superior numbers or better training or divine intervention, because of 60 grenades and 30 wires arranged according to principles learned in a copper mine in Montana. On the 4th day, Captain Morrison ordered John to build 3 more traps. Same design, he said. Cover the other approaches. John built them, worked another 72 hours with hands that had finally regained their feeling, which meant they hurt continuously now. Each trap was slightly different, adapted to its specific terrain. One used 43 grenades, one used 62, one used 58. He documented everything in a notebook he carried, sketching diagrams, noting distances, calculating blast radiuses, and cascade timings. 2 of the traps detonated over the next week. Combined casualties, approximately 52 German soldiers. The numbers were estimates. The blasts made counting difficult. By Christmas, word had spread through the American command structure. Some corporal in the 101st had created a new defensive system. Engineers were studying his diagrams. Officers were incorporating his principles into defensive planning. The system had a name now: Progressive Detonation Trap, or PDT in the acronym-loving military bureaucracy. John Reynolds, who had never wanted to be an engineer or a soldier or anything except perhaps a mine foreman like his father, received a Bronze Star for valor. The ceremony happened in a frozen field behind the lines. A colonel he'd never met read a citation about innovation and courage, pinned the medal to his jacket, shook his hand. Sergeant Kennedy, who had called the system a stupid trap and a waste of munitions, stood in the formation with the rest of the men. When the ceremony ended, he approached John and extended his hand. "I was wrong," Kennedy said, "about your trap, about you." John shook the hand. "You were right about one thing, Sergeant." "What's that?" "It was stupid to think the mathematics could save us. We just got lucky that this time they did." But the story doesn't end with the medal or the recognition or even with the adoption of John Reynolds' principles into military doctrine. Stories that matter never end cleanly. They continue, spiraling forward through consequences that the original actors never imagined. John Reynolds survived the war, came home to Montana in August 1945, with his Bronze Star, his nightmares, and a Purple Heart he'd earned in March, when a German sniper's bullet had torn through his shoulder during a patrol near Remagen. The shoulder wound had been bad. The bullet had shattered his collarbone, nicked the subclavian artery. He'd been certain he was dying as his squad dragged him back to the aid station, blood soaking through his uniform faster than they could apply pressure. He'd felt the same sensation he'd felt watching his father's coffin being lowered into Montana ground. This is how it ends. This is the mathematics of mortality. But then something unexpected happened. Something that would change his understanding of the war as profoundly as his first firefight had changed his understanding of death. At the aid station, a surgeon examined him. Didn't shake his head sadly. Didn't tell him to make peace with God. Instead, the surgeon said, "We can fix this." And within 20 minutes, John was on an operating table. No waiting, no triage line where he might bleed out while doctors attended to more critical cases. Just immediate, competent medical care from a surgeon who had anesthesia and antibiotics and the time to work carefully. The operation took 3 hours. When John woke up, his shoulder was bandaged, his arm was in a sling, and he was alive. The surgeon visited him the next day. "You're lucky," he said. "Another inch and that bullet would have hit your heart. As it is, you'll have full range of motion back in about 6 months." John had stared at him. "Just like that? No permanent damage? Just like that. Modern medicine, Corporal. Assuming you don't do anything stupid while you're healing." It was the casualness of the statement that shocked John. The implication that surviving a catastrophic injury was routine, expected, that the mathematics of mortality could be overcome through organization and resources and will. He thought about it during his recovery, thought about how his father had died from an injury that was probably less severe than his own, a collapsed lung from a falling beam. His father had lasted 6 hours before succumbing to internal bleeding in a mining camp that had one doctor, no blood supply, and medical equipment from before the First World War, had died because there was no system to save him. No organization that could move resources fast enough. No mathematics of survival. Only the arithmetic of loss. The contrast haunted him. He was alive because America could afford to station surgeons at field hospitals with full equipment. Because supply chains stretched across an ocean to deliver antibiotics to a single corporal who'd been shot. Because someone had decided that saving soldiers was worth the enormous investment in medical infrastructure. His father had died because saving miners wasn't worth the same investment. The realization was devastating, not in a sudden way, but slowly, like watching a support beam crack under too much weight. Understanding that the difference between life and death wasn't courage or skill or even luck. It was priority, organization, a social decision about who deserved to be saved. 3 months later, when he'd recovered enough to be discharged, a colonel from the Army Corps of Engineers contacted him, wanted him to consult on defensive engineering, help develop training materials based on his progressive detonation system, maybe even teach at one of the military schools. John declined, thanked the colonel politely, and went home to Montana instead. He didn't go back to the mines. Used his GI Bill to study civil engineering at Montana State. Graduated in 1949. Spent the next 30 years designing safety systems for industrial sites, mine supports, factory emergency exits, building codes for earthquake zones. Applied the same principles he'd learned from his father and used in the Ardennes. Redundancy, progressive failure analysis, mathematical certainty in the service of keeping people alive. He never spoke about the war, never displayed his Bronze Star, never attended reunions or answered letters from military historians wanting to document his innovative defensive system. When his children asked about the medals in the drawer, he told them they were for doing his job and nothing more. But sometimes, late at night, he would wake from dreams of wire and snow and walk through his house, checking that all the doors were locked. Calculating in his sleep how many seconds it would take for disaster to reach each room, planning escape routes with the same precision he'd once used to plan killing zones. His wife learned not to ask about these nights, learned to make coffee and sit with him at the kitchen table while he sketched diagrams on napkins. Never grenades, always structural supports, working through problems that existed only in his memory. "You saved a lot of lives," she told him once, after he'd been particularly haunted. "You should be proud." "I killed 77 men," he'd answered. "I can count them. 62 in my traps, 15 in firefights. I know the exact number because I checked. Counted the bodies when we advanced through the positions. Some of them had photographs in their pockets. Some of them had letters they never finished writing. I took those letters so their families might receive them. Most of the letters were in German. I couldn't read them. But I could read the handwriting, could see where the ink blotted because the writer's hand was cold, where the paper was creased from being carried in a pocket, where someone had written and then crossed out words, looking for the right thing to say to people they loved. "They were trying to kill you," his wife had said softly. I know that. I know if I hadn't built those traps, they would have overrun our position and killed all of us. I know the mathematics justified it. I know it was necessary. But knowing something is necessary doesn't make it stop happening in your head every time you close your eyes. He'd paused then, looking at his hands. The same hands that had strung wire and armed grenades and closed the eyes of dying men. My father taught me how to keep people alive. And I used what he taught me to kill people with such efficiency that it changed military doctrine. Is that pride? Is that accomplishment? Or is that just more evidence that the mathematics don't save us? They just help us manage the collapse. His wife had no answer. Nobody did. Some questions exist not to be answered, but to be carried. John Reynolds died in 1996 at the age of 73. Heart attack. Quick, his doctor said. Probably didn't even know it was happening. His funeral was small. Family mostly. A few colleagues from his engineering firm. One veteran who'd served with him in the 101st, an old man now who stood by the grave and didn't speak, but placed a single grenade pin on the coffin before it was lowered into the ground. The progressive detonation trap, the system that John had invented in desperation during 3 days in December 1944, became a standard element of defensive engineering. Modern versions use claymore mines instead of grenades, use electronic triggers instead of wire, use computer-calculated firing sequences instead of mechanical cascades. But the principle remains: redundancy, progressive failure, mathematical certainty. Military academies teach it now, not always crediting John Reynolds by name. Military innovation has a way of becoming anonymous, but using his diagrams, his principles, his understanding that defense is just engineering applied to the problem of survival. Scholars debate whether the progressive detonation trap changed the outcome of the Battle of the Bulge. Probably not, most conclude. The battle turned on logistics and weather and larger strategic factors. One corporal's innovation, no matter how elegant, couldn't shift the weight of history. But it changed the outcome for the men in John Reynolds' section. They survived, went home, had children who had children. 77 German soldiers died, and because they died, approximately 43 American soldiers lived. The arithmetic is simple. The morality is not. In Butte, Montana, in the basement of the Mining Museum, there is a display about safety innovations in industrial mining. One panel discusses progressive support systems that prevent tunnel collapses. The text credits a miner named Thomas Reynolds, who developed the system in the 1930s. The display doesn't mention that Thomas died in a collapse anyway. Doesn't mention that his son used the same principles to kill Germans in the Ardennes forest. History is selective, remembers what it finds useful, forgets what makes it uncomfortable. But sometimes, in winter, when snow falls heavy in the mountains, there are still men in Montana who wake at 4:17 a.m. and check that their doors are locked, who count the seconds it takes to reach each room, who remember the sound of wire singing as it's pulled taut, and the way snow whispers when it falls on dead men. These men don't talk about the war, don't explain the diagrams they sketch on napkins, or the mathematics they calculate in the margins of newspapers. Don't try to justify what they did or didn't do in moments when the difference between life and death was determined by tension in a wire and the speed of cascading explosions. They just carry it. The way Thomas Reynolds carried his knowledge of support systems that couldn't save him. The way John Reynolds carried the letters he took from dead soldiers. The way we all carry the innovations we make to survive, unsure whether survival is victory or just another form of collapse happening slowly enough that we can pretend we're still standing. In the Ardennes forest, if you know where to look, you can still find fragments. rusted wire, grenade pins corroded green, bits of metal that might be shrapnel or might be pieces of the earth returning to itself. The forest has reclaimed the killing ground. Pine trees grow where men died. Snow falls each December, covering everything, making it all look peaceful and new. But underneath, if you dig, the mathematics are still there. The calculations that turn defensive grenades into a system of cascading detonation. The principles that saved some lives by ending others. The geometry of survival written in the soil. And if you listen carefully, on certain winter mornings around 4:17 a.m., when the snow falls heavy and the forest is quiet, you might hear the sound of wire singing as it's pulled taut. The sound of a young corporal from Montana, hands wrapped in torn undershirt, building something that looks stupid until it saves your life. Building something that kills 77 men so 43 can go home. Building something that his father taught him because his father learned it from the earth, and the earth is a brutal teacher. The sound of someone doing the work because it needs doing. Trusting the mathematics because trust is all that's left. Hoping that this time, unlike the number 7 shaft, the calculations are right. This time, they were.